So USAID was doing RCTs, and that was a part of the work of that unit that focused on cost effectiveness, because that was one of the methods that they used to determine whether or not projects were effective before you even think about whether or not it's cost effective, just to see whether or not the actual intervention worked. But I will say an RCT is one of a range of methods you can use. And I think we have to be careful about, I know it's important to think about causation, but a lot of the work that we do in the meal space more recently has focused on contribution rather than attribution.
Hi, and welcome to the Simple Charity Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Grasso. I love social science, and today's episode was especially fun for me for this reason. In 2025, we saw significant disruptions to international development as U.S. foreign aid was frozen and unfrozen, transitioned to the State Department, and generally put on hold. I wanted to have someone on the show who had experience working on projects for USAID to talk about the value of international development in the field of monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning. Amelia Thompson is my guest today. She has a master's in international education policy from Harvard, another master's from St. John's University, and an executive degree in impact finance innovation from Oxford, and she is perfect for this conversation. She has experience working on international development projects funded by USAID and has seen that work ended in 2025 because of the dismantling of the agency. Amelia and I talk a lot about research methodologies that enable us to understand the impact of social programs. We also discuss the strengths and weaknesses of government-run foreign aid programs, as well as the power of the church supporting international development through philanthropy. So join me for a fascinating conversation about monitoring and evaluation in international development programs. This is your podcast. So as always, please send me your thoughts, your questions, and suggestions at brian@simplecharity.org. And if the show is helpful, please click a 5-star rating in your podcast app. This really helps get the algorithm to get the show out to more listeners. Also hit subscribe, whether you're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. Thanks so much. I'm so glad you're with us today.
Hi, my name is Melissa, and I serve as a Simple Charity philanthropic advisor to individuals, couples, families, foundations, and family offices in the Raleigh-Durham, Chapel Hill area of North Carolina, but also to clients around the country. If you're curious about your own generosity journey and would like help thinking through a philanthropic strategy with intentionality to discern where God is calling you to love people, to find excellent nonprofits to partner with, or to understand the impact of your current grant making, I would love to connect and share more about Simple Charity's philanthropic advising offerings. You can connect with me at melissahall@simplecharity.org. That's Melissa Hall at simplecharity.org. And you can learn more about us at simplecharity.org. That's simplecharity.org.
Well, Amelia Thompson, welcome to the Simple Charity Podcast.
Thrilled to be here, Brian. Thank you so much.
Amelia, what are you grateful for today?
I am so grateful for, I love the summer. So summer is my absolute favorite season. I do like that the transition point, and today feels like a transition moment. And so I'm grateful for the briskness of the air.
Yes. Yeah, as we were recording this, it is October 3rd, and it is a cooler day here in Atlanta. And I'm actually surprised to hear you say that, Amelia, that you love the summer, even in Atlanta, even with the heat,
especially
and the
in
concrete,
Atlanta.
Especially in Atlanta. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. What's your favorite thing about summer?
I just love how green the city gets. I'm from New York, and so I love New York. I love the summer in New York as well. But it's just a bit more. I find it's super humid in New York City during the summer, and certainly not nearly as green because in Atlanta I feel like we live in a forest. So I think it's just a beautiful time.
Yeah, that is an apt description of Atlanta, a city in a forest. It's very much that way for those who have not traveled here and driven around. Well, Amelia, I'm really excited for this conversation to learn from you as someone with subject matter expertise in impact monitoring and evaluation. to start, give us a quick overview of your career journey and some of the educational credentials that I'm sure will be a part of the intro, but tell us a little bit about your career and your educational journey.
Sure, happy to do that. Um, I began my career in New York City. I was responsible for overseeing, in partnership with the mayor's office, overseeing an initiative that combats poverty by supporting communities to better help them engage young people who are involved in the justice system. And so this was during Mayor Bloomberg's tenure in New York City, and it was just a really exciting time to be thinking about how to support community reintegration through advancing and supporting the capacity of key local implementers and partners. And
Mm,
that got me really interested in education. And so I spent some time after that experience in the classroom and thinking about how to not just wait for young people to end up in the justice system, but how to be really
mm,
intentional about preventing dropouts, and which is why I made that transition into education. And when I was working as a teacher, I also became really interested not just in how to support education outcomes for our children here in the US, but also what happens to students around the world, and more specifically, girls in Sub Saharan Africa.
mm,
I started a project. It actually began as a volunteer project for a birthday. Instead of hosting a birthday party, I invited some friends to bring over feminine hygiene products. And we
mm,
used those products to create care packages for girls who were a part of an organization that I learned about through my church. The organization is called GEMS, and they help girls transition out of sex trafficking in New York City. And so after that sort of outreach project, we created 10 care packages and donated those to GEMS. I started to wonder, well, what happens when girls reach puberty in countries around the world? And I discovered that girls often drop out of school. And it's not necessarily because of them reaching puberty or starting to menstruate, but it's one of the factors that complicates their ability to go to school. And so that led me into international development. And because I'd already been doing work around learning and strategy, I started to just sort of naturally fall into work that focuses on impact measurement and evaluation and outcome measurement. So that's been the work that's I've really focused a lot in the area of meal or monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning, and engage in different projects that focus in those areas. And the beauty of that work, I think, for me, is how to help teams and organizations and systems make meaning and make sense out of the work that we do, whether that's funding or the programming or policies. And so that work has been complemented by studying at Harvard. I completed a master's there in international education policy. I also have another master's that I completed prior to that in education, and that was more focused in the US context, and that was completed at St. John's. And my undergraduate career was at Vassar, and I studied political science, and then also minored in Africana studies and Mandarin.
that's quite a resume, Amelia. I think you mentioned getting a master's from Harvard, and then you kept going with and then you're talking about your credentials and then another master's. And well, we're really grateful to have you on the show to talk about meal, to talk about how nonprofits or government agencies know that the programs that they're implementing are actually achieving the results that they are claiming to achieve. This is a very interesting topic for givers and philanthropists. 3 out of 5 affluent givers in America say, I am not sure if the giving I'm doing is making an impact. I don't know if it's actually making a difference. And that's of the people who are giving. I think there's even higher levels, certainly, of skepticism and distrust of both nonprofit programs and government programs for people who do not give to charity. So, the people who do give to charity, 3 out of 5 say, I don't know if my giving that I'm doing is making a difference. And so thinking about this issue and how do we measure, how do we evaluate, and how do we learn is a really important thing to understand. And I think it's a way to understand, just what's happening in the world, like with USAID has been in the news a lot. And I think I have a degree in global health. I personally think there's a tremendous amount of misinformation and misconceptions about who USAID is and what they do and actually how they implement work. I've heard people say, well, U.S. foreign aid should be structured in such a way that it makes it like market competition. How do we use market competition to make sure that in private sector actors, and that's why we have to get rid of USAID, not realizing that I believe it's 80% of USAID's work was structured in such a way that contracts were put out into the marketplace for different businesses or nonprofit entities to bid on. So it's actually using these free market principles, or it was using these free market principles in order to get the work done in a competitive process through private sector agencies, including many faith-based agencies. And so I just think even that context and that understanding has been missing from the conversation, let alone this whole conversation of this field of study that now exists around monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And I think we actually have a great deal of confidence in certain programs around the world that they're working. Would you agree with that? Do you think it's possible to spend millions of dollars on a program and, given your perspective, to say this is working? Or how often is it that we really don't know whether something's working, or do we just waste money in international development? What's kind of your overall view of how confident we should be in international development work?
I appreciate you starting by painting the context of how often the work is funded, right? It is a competitive process. They are competitive processes. And so it's not just the U.S. government or private donors just giving away hundreds of thousands or hundreds of millions of dollars for just something out there in the world to happen, right? And so I would even take us even before those sorts of competitive processes begin. There's really a lot of work that's done to figure out what problems should we be actually tackling so that we can make sure, to answer your question, is the work effective, right? So we usually start from a point of saying we realize in this specific context that youth unemployment, as an example, is a huge challenge, not just for the young people who aren't employed, but also in terms of that local economy, right? They're not then able to maximize the potential of those young people. And so that local context suffers, and that country's ultimately GDP suffers, right? And so in thinking about, is the work effective and does the work actually work? There are so many processes and approaches to actually do just that. And USAID had an entire wing devoted to evaluation. And more recently, they'd hired an economist in who's world renowned really for his work on cost effectiveness studies to think about whether or not only is the work working, but how do we do so in a way that maximizes each dollar, right? And so that approach to cost effectiveness was actually innovative and takes us a step beyond traditional evaluations. So
you know who that economist was? Do you remember off the top of your head? Do you know who that economist was?
Yes,
do you remember
Dean Carlin.
He is a famous. So I have a degree in economics and development economics.
So you know him?
And yes. So I've read studies from Dean Carlin. Yes.
Yeah, and his work is. I'm sorry.
I said that was years ago, but
right.
Yes.
No, he's terrific. His work is terrific, and not just recognized in the U.S., but really globally as a thought leader in the world of thinking about how we maximize each donor's investment. And so on that side of things, so to answer this question, I can also be honest and say, in working in this space, there are things we know that don't work well, but that's a part of the evaluation process. And traditionally, when we come to a point of understanding that things aren't aligning, and that's true not just in the world of international development, that's true in business as well, right? Once you start implementing an approach, a strategy, you run into challenges, you realize you're not meeting your targets. And so then there are processes to take a step back and to say, what do we do differently? USAID had recently started this work, not so recently, actually. It's been, I think, for at least 15 years, an actual point in a project that they call the pause and reflect period. So that's when you bring together key stakeholders, including the participants and the community members who are a part of receiving those services to think about what actually is happening, what are the outcomes we're seeing, and what are some of the unintended consequences, and are these things moving us closer to our targets? And if not, what should we do differently? And so there are times actually a team may decide that what we've been funding in this area isn't showing that it's effective, and actually it's causing harm. So we should stop doing that, right? And
Mm.
it's a thoughtful way of just thinking about what are we doing, why are we doing it, and what should be stopped or what should be strengthened so that it can be even more effective. And so I wouldn't
Mhm.
at all suggest that all the work that's funded, that has historically been funded in this space, has been effective. I wouldn't say that at all. And I think we could actually look at the number of people who remain in poverty around the world. I think there's a real question for us to sit with and say, well, what is happening? What are we funding? And I do think if you were to really kind of drill down and to think about how we've improved the quality of life, even if it hasn't necessarily moved people out of poverty, because poverty is complex and it's multifaceted, I think there's a lot to learn there, and there's a lot of value there. But I think part of the conversation that we're in this context, and this question about the value of international development work, I think it actually, some of it is helpful because I think we should be more committed to thinking about how we ensure more people and communities around the world are actually moved out of poverty and that they can sustain those new levels without, in the face of shocks or stressors that may try and drive them back into the previous position of poverty that they face. So I hope that's clear. It's yes, the work is effective, not at all times, and yes, we could do better.
Yes. I think that's a great summary. How do we know it's effective? Give us an overview of what meal is, of what sort of projects people who their full-time job is the monitoring and evaluation of social impact work, whether through government agencies or nonprofits. What did those people do? Tell us about this job.
Yeah. So we typically are responsible for thinking about and partnering with who we consider to be the sectoral experts. And so let's say you're working on a project that focuses on improving water access or hygiene standards in a community, or you're focused on a project that's thinking about how to improve the ability for farmers to produce high quality crops that are then brought to the market and then generate an income. So you partner with the technical leads in those areas who are seen as experts in those areas. And then you think about and you create what's considered to be a results framework, which is ultimately a strategy for identifying the key goals that you have in mind, and then the sub goals depending on the other areas of focus that the project is devoted to. And so for each, the way that we think about it, there's like an overarching goal, and then there are maybe three. We try not to do like, sometimes you have more depending on how complex the initiative is, but we try to keep the number of strategic objectives to around three so that they're a bit
Okay.
more manageable. And so the overarching goal might be to improve or to ensure that the entrepreneurship and employment systems in a specific community are working well and ensuring that more young people are either in jobs or starting successful businesses. Right? That's like really wordy. Not that not what would end up on the final results framework, but something like that. Right? As in terms of like the overarching vision.
Improve employment for unemployed youth.
Exactly. Thank you. That's way simpler. Exactly right. And so with under that overall goal, you would think about what objectives need to be achieved for us to get there. And so one might be supporting service providers in that community to make sure that they're working more in a more coordinated way. Another goal might be to ensure young people are trained in the areas that are specific and that are responsive to what employers want and need. And a third area might be engaging employers to make sure that once we actually train these young people, we have employers in place to receive them and to welcome them into employment. And so within each of those strategic objectives or SOs, then you drill down and you think about what are the activities that are needed to make sure those SOs are accomplished. And so in terms of the meal team or the meal leads, they're responsible for helping the technical experts to design that sort of framework and then to develop a process to figure out how do we evaluate whether this is working and not to wait until the year after the project has started up, but how do
Right.
we develop systems
Bake it in
and
from
learning
the beginning.
processes that are that allow us to check in on our progress on a quarterly basis, semi-annual basis, and then ultimately for the long term as well. So that's just one way that we think about how we engage the work to make sure projects are moving forward and also achieving our goals.
So one challenge with this, and this is a fundamental challenge in much of social science, is that correlation does not mean causation. And that when a program gets implemented, we don't have, what social science called the counterfactual. So what would have happened if that program was not implemented? We don't have that information. So how do you think about the challenge of causation as you are evaluating a program? And is there a way to actually be able to say,
Hmm.
hey, this program improved unemployment rates, increased youth employment by 15%, 20%, and this was causal. This wasn't just a correlation. This wasn't just, something else happened to the economy at the same time that led to this result, but we actually are confident that this program led to this result. How do you think about that?
Yeah, and I think that the work around randomized controlled trials that do employ this sort of experimental approach to then get to be able to identify a causal impact, I think it's hugely important. In some circles, it's considered the gold standard, and I think it is under the right and within the right context, right? I think
Can you define
RCTs.
a randomized? Can you define what an
Sure,
RCT
sorry,
is?
yeah. So a
No,
randomized
it's all good.
RCTs or randomized controlled trials are an experimental approach to thinking about and sort of evaluating whether or not a project or an initiative is effective by using a counterfactual and a sort of treatment group, right? So you
Hmm.
think about you have like two arms of the study, and one focuses on a group that is receiving the intervention or the services, and the other doesn't. And you monitor and you track both of those groups over a period of time, and then you look at their outcomes and you compare the two to determine whether or not the intervention or the project or the service was effective or and improved outcomes versus the group that didn't receive those services.
Excellent. Yeah. So for our listeners who aren't familiar with this methodology, it's basically like a clinical trial where there's a placebo and there's a pill that actually has a drug in it. And so what you're looking at is for that intervention group, but there's all sorts of things that have to be true for randomized control trials to have relevance. So for example, the randomization has to not fail. That means that the treatment and the control group have to be very similar and any imaginable characteristic that you can measure. So it's
That's right.
demographically, they're similar, they're around the same educational level and economic level and gender, composition and all of these things so that you can really compare, hey, we did this one thing here, and here's this other group that is basically the same, roughly the same, and here's the effect of the intervention. Um, yeah, so you're saying that's an approach to talk about causality. So does your team, and Meal, like in the sector, is USAID doing randomized controlled trials? Like what's the strength and the rigor of a lot of evaluation work that happens in international development?
So USAID was doing RCTs, and that was a part of the work of that unit that focused on cost effectiveness, because that was one of the methods that they used to determine whether or not projects were effective before you even think about whether or not it's cost effective to see whether or not the actual intervention worked. But I will say an RCT is one of a range of methods you can use. And I think we have to be careful about I know it's important to think about causation, but a lot of the work that we do in the meal space more recently has focused on contribution rather than
Mm,
attribution, right? So how do you
mm.
determine to what extent the work that you've done, whether with stakeholders or with the intervention or the implementation of the intervention itself, has contributed to some change in the target group? And I think thinking about it in that way is it's much more realistic. Also, it isn't easy. I think I should also sort of start from a point of saying measurement, whether you're thinking about RCTs or other approaches and methodologies. These are all sort of nebulous things, right? To identify, to create indicators, and then to try and assess to what extent. Well, first, even to define those indicators, and then to assess to what extent we are moving toward accomplishing those. These are all nebulous and imperfect approaches to an attempt to determine how effective our work is, right? But then to circle back to your question, this idea of causality is hugely important, and there's tons of work that's happening in this space. There's some really notable leads, like I don't know if you're familiar with JPAL, that's based at MIT, or IPA, Innovations in Poverty Action. Really tremendous work, and I think often when policymakers are looking to determine what sorts of approaches should be scaled, typically they look at RCTs and look at those sorts of institutes, well, the JPAL or IPA, to then determine what work should be scaled in context around the world. So I do think RCTs are hugely important, and we should continue to support them. They're also very expensive, very time consuming, and they do require really specific expertise. And so it's the work that we should continue to fund, but we should know that it's not the only tool in the toolbox when we're thinking about assessing contribution.
What other tools are in our toolbox?
Yeah, I think it depends. So I usually start by thinking about what actually do we want to measure, right? Are we wanting to gauge a sense of satisfaction of the participants, as an example, who are engaged in the work? Or are we wanting to think about whether or not the adoption of a new approach that's a part of a larger intervention has made a difference? That determines usually which approach or what sort of tool we're going to deploy. And so you can think about, you can engage groups in focus group discussions. You can also host key informant interviews. You can engage in more experiential sorts of ways of evaluating contribution. One of the ways that I really appreciate is called the sense maker approach, where you invite participants to not just respond to a set of questions, but you actually invite them to kind of embody a sort of sense of how does this make you feel by using maps that become like 3D, so that you get to gauge and sort of invite participants to sort of place themselves along a spectrum, where they're able to say, based on where I am today, this is how this project has made me feel. These are just some of the tools that you can deploy depending on what you actually are wanting to assess. There also are some like quasi-experimental approaches that include some degree of randomization. And randomization is hard to do often, and so that's why sometimes the quasi-experimental approaches, where you're looking at a group that may not have been randomized at the same time, but you may be looking at a group that engaged in the service the year before this new intervention was developed, and you try and compare the outcomes in that way. So
can I give an example of that I just thought of, that I think maybe our listeners will know, just to make it concrete? But there's going to be a ton of quasi-experimental approach articles being written, I think, about cell phones in schools over the next couple years, because probably a lot of our listeners have heard of the book, The Anxious Generation. Jonathan Haidt wrote this book. It has been changing policy at the state level, but not all states have banned cell phones in schools. So what we're having at a national level is this massive quasi-experimental, transition period, where we'll be able to compare, during this year, last year and this year, the next year, states that have banned phones in schools and states that have kept phones in schools. And there's going to be a lot of economists and and sociologists writing articles about that, because it's an amazing opportunity. But that would be an example of quasi-experimental, where, we have roughly the same group. Like if we're comparing, Georgia and North Carolina, and let's say, I don't know if this is true, but let's say one of them, has banned phones in schools, the other one hasn't. Then we can look at, okay, in the same school year, here are the outcomes educationally, here are the outcomes, in terms of mental health and all these things, and then actually have some evidence that phones in schools are really good for kids, which is my hunch, or not, that's not my hunch, sorry. Phones in schools are really bad for kids, or there's no effect or whatever the outcomes of that are. So that would be an example. Or actually, correct me if I'm wrong, but that would be, I think, an example of a quasi-experimental, like sometimes unevenly distributed program implementation or policy shocks and policy changes can create parameters where we can actually learn something really meaningful about the social transformations that are happening.
That's right.
Well, I love though that you talked a lot about qualitative examples when I asked you for more tools of the toolkit, like the sense maker. I've never heard of the sense maker. Why do you think qualitative assessments of impact are important and meaningful?
Yeah, I think when we are ultimately our work focuses on human subjects, right? And certainly there is, and we also, this isn't to diminish the value and the need for quantitative approaches to assessment, but because we often are dealing with just people and their experiences, that's hard to often quantify, which is why the qualitative approaches are often what we rely on, because it's hard often to quantify the difference, as an example of what you're describing, how anxious a student who's using a cell phone feels versus young people who aren't using cell phones as regularly, right? That's hard to sort of make sense of or to sort of translate into numbers. But I think having conversations and engaging in sort of thoughtful group discussions or individual discussions, I think that helps to just better understand what someone's experience is, which is why qualitative approaches are often used depending on the setting and depending on the research needs.
Do you think one of them is more meaningful than the other, quantitative versus qualitative? Or is it just really highly contextualized in what the program being implemented is?
Yeah, I don't think that one is more meaningful necessarily. I think it's about understanding what it is we're wanting to measure and which approach will help us do that. And I often think that mixed methods approaches help often paint a sort of fuller picture, a more rich picture. So I would encourage most studies that I've engaged in, there is some element of both quantitative and qualitative analysis. So I usually think that a mixed method approach will help us paint a fuller picture.
Yeah. So there's this element of kind of triangulating the information. I think if there's something very intuitive to me that if some program that I experience is helpful, that I would know that it's helpful and be able to articulate why. And maybe that's not always the case, but I do think that in a lot of conversations, again, around phones in schools, if you talk to Gen Z kids, they will tell you that phones are very bad, for education. And I think that's where a lot of the conversation, it's not that people are unaware of their own condition and how their environment and the things they're experiencing are affecting them. It's actually precisely the opposite, that I actually think that qualitative assessments of impact can provide a richness that we don't get from the quantitative numbers, and the quantitative numbers have to rely on these instruments that are imperfect, and even then it's like validating an instrument. So it's talking about anxiety. I could ask a kid, does not having your phone in school make you more or less anxious, and why? And I think if I asked 25 kids that, then I would actually get this really rich data set. Or I could use a validated anxiety screening instrument that has 10 questions, and I could share that with those 25 kids, and they check off, I don't know, whatever questions. Like it probably would say, I feel anxious most mornings, and check or not check, or I get great sleep at night versus not, or whatever kind of validated instrument question. So that would be the two methodologies. But even in that case, I think I would rather have the interviews. I think I would rather have the human understanding and the qualitative component for in terms of knowing whether or not this thing is working. But that's maybe partially why this work is so hard to know what we're working, because it's a lot harder to sort out that qualitative information. I don't know. What do you make of that notion?
I mean, I think with the example you share, which is a great one, I think that's actually why a mixed method approach to studying something like anxiety is is more helpful. Because again, I think it paints a picture that's a bit more rich, a bit more nuanced than either just using the validated instrument would allow us, or just using the responses to qualitative methods. So I typically just think that if we were to kind of think about how we approach measuring whatever the concept is, and this one we're talking about anxiety in both qualitative and quantitative ways, I think it just allows us to think more in more nuanced ways and with a bit more texture about whatever that subject is. And so I wouldn't, for me, and I know this people.
So you wouldn't say one is more important than the other. You'd be adamant about we really need both.
Try and use both approaches and see what picture is created or painted.
Yeah. That's helpful. I think that is a really helpful way of thinking about social impact measurement and evaluation. I want to circle back. You mentioned JPOW. Are they at MIT? Okay.
Yes, they're at MIT.
They're at MIT. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So basically founded, I think, and led by Esther Duflo, Abhijit Banerjee. Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee actually won the Nobel Prize in Economics, I think, in 2019 for their work on international development evaluation.
Right,
so
that's right.
Using RCTs. Everyone talks about RCTs. So there are other methodologies. It's funny. The peak of my academic achievement, Amelia, I haven't been to grad school, but the peak of my academic achievement was my last semester of college at Duke. I got to take a PhD level class with Duncan Thomas, who has co-authored papers with Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee. He's kind of Duke's person who uses that same approach and methodology of applying microeconomic frameworks and having an empirical approach to international development. And so I got to take a PhD level class with him on empirical methods and development economics. And I think during that experience, I think I was, real quick on RCTs, I think it was interesting. He would argue RCTs are really famous, but he was a big fan of this methodology called using instrumental variables. So there are actually other really fancy ways of determining causality even without an RCT, without a control group. Basically, you find a variable that doesn't correlate with the that doesn't correlate with the outcome variable, but does correlate with one of the kind of input variables that you're looking for, or I'm not describing it very well, but it's a very fancy statistical technique where you can make a claim of causality. But I think what I was really fascinated by, my big takeaway from that class, was just that we actually know a lot. Not every study, even in RCT, has what social scientists call external generalizability. Like, it's not that every study that gets done that builds this body of knowledge, it's like, okay, if this worked in, a small town in Kenya, that doesn't necessarily mean it will work in a small town in Uganda. So sometimes, the same intervention doesn't work everywhere. But even that aside, there's so much knowledge about what does work. In my point of view, like, for example, education improves life outcomes. That is an established fact in social science. If you reduce barriers to education, you don't even, you can track them, you can do those studies again, but it is an established fact that every year of additional education is going to improve, income, lifetime earnings. It's going to improve social relationships, mental health, all of these things. And I think what I get, zooming out in light of that, what I get a little bit frustrated about in some conversations, public conversations around international development, is this idea that all of this stuff is not working. This kind of painting of a broad brush of, and I wanted to have a conversation about this. There's even this notion that, I think Dambisa Moyo wrote this at the start of her book, Dead Aid, and I think William Easterly has made this point. You look at the hundreds of billions of dollars that have been invested in international development over the last 40 years. And what do we have to show for it? We still have so much extreme poverty. And I don't think I agree with that train of thought, because we don't have the counterfactual, and it is a mixed bag. But I don't agree with, I guess, what that train of thought implies. And I think the implication for that, and what some people have gotten from that train of thought, is we're wasting money doing this work. And I don't think that's true, because I think a lot of what we're doing is working. I think extreme poverty rates are, in the scope of human history, plummeting over the last 2 decades. I think 2 billion people have gained access to water, sanitation, and hygiene. We're providing people access to safe drinking water faster than population growth, and the parts of the world with the fastest population growth. So, education rates are increasing, and then there's these amazing success stories. There's Rwanda, people don't talk about Rwanda enough, like Rwanda has had one of the fastest GDP growth in the world for multiple years. And that's coming out of the genocide in 1994. And just the way I think at one point Rwanda had the highest percentage of women in Congress in the world, in the last couple decades. And so I'm sorry to have you on the podcast and then I gave you this long monologue, but I want to hear your thoughts on this issue of, I guess, at the highest level, how we talk about international development. Like, is it working or not working? And I think we need a lot more optimism and a lot more, we need to be reading the JPAL articles. Those need to be informing policy and need to be informing practice. But we also certainly should not be giving up hope that giving and allocating funds to international development, like, we've never had more knowledge. We've never been more effective in human history at alleviating poverty than we are now. Anyways, curious what you make of that long extended rant.
No, I think it's helpful to think about, as you're saying, really what we are seeing and what we've seen historically, and then to also be able to pinpoint specific examples. Botswana is another example of a country where we've seen tremendous improvement in terms of quality of life. Even if we were to look beyond sub-Saharan Africa, if we look at a place like Bangladesh, where we've seen a lot of the work that started in Bangladesh, especially around poverty alleviation, has been used to inform similar approaches in countries around the world. And so I think it's also helpful, though, to be honest about, and to some extent, a country would engage in funding the development of another nation. And some of it, I certainly do think, is because we're really genuinely interested in wanting to see another country prosper. But I do think there are some things that work for the country that's willing to fund that kind of work that's beyond just wanting to support another country. And I think it really works for that country's own security. It works for this idea of soft power. I think it works for this idea of what it means to be seen as a global leader, whether that's advancing human rights or other sorts of qualities that are seen as what a country should represent. And I think those are the things that the United States wants represented and once stood for. I think that's been really challenged in this current context. And so I think funding the development of another nation works, but not necessarily in all the ways that we talk about or want to talk about in sort of just, mainstream conversation. I think it does. I think it's an effective strategy to win friends and to the extent we can reduce the likelihood of engaging in war. There's a story I remember. I can't remember the context. I think it might have been, it was in Asia. And I think USAID was funding work to demine with country, but that helped in that process. There was some intelligence that was shared that then prevented a future, what could have become a terrorist strike, right? And so I think even showing up in friendly terms in that way, whether you're supporting that sort of activity or supporting health infrastructure in a country, I think it demonstrates to other countries that we are at least willing to be friends, right? And whether that still means that we want to be first, that's a separate conversation, but
Yeah,
we're at
right.
least willing to play in the sandbox. And I don't think we're in that place right now. That's not what we're willing to do. So I think I think it works for a range of reasons that don't always focus on the benefits to the country that's receiving that development support.
Yeah.
But I do,
So
and also just
yeah,
one other thing, I think in terms of some of the work that USAID funded did destabilize and did
I was about to bring that up. Yeah,
yeah.
of because people make the other opposite argument of we funded terrorist groups.
Yes, that's right. And we destabilize foreign governments that pose a threat to our own business interests or political interests, right? And so I don't want to talk about USAID or development work in
Yeah,
general
yeah.
from a sort of Pollyanna lens that ignores the challenges and some of the motivations that aren't altruistic at all,
Yeah.
right?
Well,
Yeah.
Well, let's talk for our last few minutes of our conversation around the portion of the work in international development that is altruistically motivated, and maybe that's too strong of a word, but is charitably motivated, charitably funded. So, USAID had a budget of $40 billion. And, numbers like that, whether or not they're big numbers or small numbers, I just think it really depends on context. Americans give every year $600 billion now. So, actually, there's more money available for international development work from philanthropy than from private philanthropy. And the number one contributor for that $600 billion in the pie chart is individuals. And so not private foundations, not corporations, it is human beings who want to make a difference. I think actually there is a innate human need to make a difference and form this positive self. I think it's how we form a positive self-conception of saying I'm a person who contributes, who gives, and there's something very American about that. I'm curious about. I'm curious about, if you think that motivation matters. Like, is there, is it better for that sector to grow, that portion of the funding of the work? Is it to be able to give, not for the American self-interest reasons, but in order to give because we want to see young girls be at school. And that is the motivation. Does that lead to better work, you think? Or, is there kind of, because in international development, I think both of those impulses are strong. There's people making the self-interest, America First political case for this. And then there's a lot of actors in the system. Givers, certainly staffers, yourself, we started this conversation, and what motivates and drives you is, I think, to see that transformation. How do you think about that mix of motivations?
Yeah, I think so. I certainly do see the value in being motivated to simply want to see another country or a specific group of a specific population to benefit, even if then that benefit doesn't return to me, at least not in a sort of financial form. I think though when budgets are short or tight, when political will isn't there, I think it's hard to sort of make that motivation public, and then to drum up a lot of support for it. So I certainly do think that is a valid and appropriate reason to want to fund development. I just think in certain contexts and certainly the climate that we're in now, I just think it's
politically
hard.
winning.
It's not what wins when you're making decisions about insurance or Medicaid insurance in your own country, or employment, or immigration, right? So I think when you have that sort of table of options to consider, I think it's hard to make the case for that. But I do think there's space for other groups, right, like the church, to be committed to sort of to raising awareness and to really be driving home the moral reasons for
Right.
why we should be willing to give, even if we don't receive a direct benefit ourselves.
Yeah. 100%. I mean, I think you can make a historical argument that a significant reason we have PEPFAR, which funded AIDS relief around the world, is because of kind of a white evangelical political bloc. And at one point in time, the church was animated around caring just out of love and compassion for people with HIV/AIDS around the world. That feels different from the kind of things animating that kind of same political bloc now, and how things have shifted since then. Um, but um, but I do think that, and this is our mission at Simple Charity, is within the realm of the church, within the realms of our faith, how do we become the kind of people who are loving generously like Jesus? Like, how do we grow in that capacity and as individuals, but then also how do we do that corporately? How does philanthropy do that? Um, and Yeah, because at the end of the day, I think what matters for me in from the perspective of a philanthropist, a Christian philanthropist who's motivated by their faith to do good in the world. I think why this conversation around meal is so important is because I think for me, if love is motivating the philanthropy, and I think actually there's an element of love that really cares about whether or not what you're funding is working. um, because because you care about the people on the other side of this equation. And so I think there's actually an element of, to the extent philanthropy is motivated by love, it should be funding monitoring, evaluation, and learning. What do you make of that argument, and what case would you make to Christian philanthropists to pay for these expensive RCTs?
Yeah, what comes to mind when President Bush was asked why should we support PEPFAR, his answer was because we should be merciful, right? Those weren't his exact words, but it was really so that this is a demonstration of our willingness to be merciful to African countries, right? For the very reasons that you just named. And so I think when we are, if we're interested in actually fulfilling and showing up in ways that are consistent with who we believe in, and that is Jesus, then I think we are called to want to fund this work, and not just to fund just some sort of project or intervention, but to be really interested in what is the impact of that. And so that can only happen through funding meal. There's a verse that talks about being interested in taking diligent account of your flock, right? And the only way that you can do that is if you have the resources and the tools to actually measure and count and actually assess how that flock is doing over time, right? And so that to me is the biblical a verse that points specifically to. Certainly meal is not written out in that verse, but for me, I read that through the lens of the work I've done, and I see a reason to want to invest in approaches that allow us to assess the outcome of our work. And also, when I think about the parable of the talent, one of the things that always stands out to me is that when the king comes back to find out what's happened with the resources that he left in the hands of others, he takes an account of that, right? He says, well, this one used it, and now there's a harvest that's come from that, whereas someone else hid it out of fear. He said, at the very least, you should have gained an interest back on what I gave to you, and you can only assess whether or not that interest has accrued through measurement, right? So I think that there's certainly biblical evidence and justification for us to invest in the work to measure the progress and the outcome of whatever work we want to see in the world.
Yeah, that's good, Amelia. And I just think we've talked about kind of the realm of politics and how it intersects with international development, and now the realm of faith and how it intersects with international development. And I think in light of the tools we have for doing the work of monitoring, evaluation, and learning, if the reason you don't give, if you have a lot of capacity and would want to make a difference in the lives of global neighbors, see this theology that God is a global God, that every human being is made in the image of God and therefore has dignity and value and worth. If you have that and you want to give substantially to international development causes, and the reason you don't is skepticism of whether or not it works. Personally, I just don't think that's a convincing reason, because I actually don't think that's true. I think it requires more work to know whether or not we're doing is working. I think there are nonprofits that I can name with monitoring and evaluation and learning systems in place that have been operating for years that have a great deal of confidence of efficacy of how they're alleviating poverty, improving access to education, reducing rates of waterborne disease, and are using a set of mixed method, methodologies to have that confidence. And so I would just say, like, there's something that sounds really thoughtful about saying, oh, well, I don't give to water because, half the wells get broken anyways. But that's almost one step too short. And I think if love is our motivation, I think we should be saying, well, I just need to pay attention enough to find those programs that are working and are being actively monitored. And if the organization isn't monitoring and evaluating, well, maybe I could fund that, and we would have that information. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm wary of a kind of what feels like a cop out from engagement in international development completely, because of this fear of unintended consequences, this fear of wasting money. Those are valid concerns, and I hope I don't think we've shown that a simplistic narrative here in this conversation, but those concerns are not adequate given the sophistication of people like Amelia Thompson and the work you're doing to ensure that things are working. Those concerns are not adequate to justify disengagement in a world where poverty is a harm. Business as usual is harm. People dying, kids dying from cholera, that's the business as usual. And anyways, feel free to disagree with me. I'm getting a little bit, or yeah. What do you make of the kind of call to love and engage in the church? And I hear you saying we should have this healthy skepticism. But why engage then? And what would you say to someone who said, "Oh, that's why I don't give to global international development agencies, is because they waste the money and they don't, we don't know what's happening."
Yeah, if this is in the context of a Christian conversation,
Yeah.
I would also,
within that context.
Yep, the verse that comes to mind is like God's the sunshine is shared with both the just and the unjust. And correct me if that's the verse. Is that the right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's in this passage about loving your enemies, I think.
That's right. Thank you. And if we are motivated by the love of God, and the desire to show up in ways that demonstrate that love that is indiscriminate, not in that it's wasteful, right, but indiscriminate in that it's relentlessly committed to good, then I think there's no argument, right? We're either relentlessly committed to good, whether or not it benefits us, or we're not committed to that, right? And so if you're not committed to that, then I certainly then that argument I would say you can run with, but that's inconsistent with what it actually means to be a follower of Christ. And so if we're okay with that, then that argument can stand. But if we are committed to following Christ, then that suggests that we're committed to living and loving in ways that are consistent with what we know and what's clear and what's black and white. There are some things that are unclear, right? Even biblically. But what it means to love like the Lord, I think that's a place where I don't think is so unclear, right? And so if we are committed to that, then I think that means we're willing to share and to support others, even if it doesn't benefit us. And I think there's still room in that space of saying, well, what does that mean? And how do we share? And how do we support?
Yes.
But I think if you have resources, right, and you see someone else who lacks resources, I think one way is to be willing to share those resources. And if you're not willing to share your financial resources, then are you willing to share your intellectual resources to help improve the conditions of your neighbor, even if that neighbor is hundreds of miles away or thousands of miles away, right? So I think there are ways to be committed to the call of Christ. And I think most people are reluctant who have that argument, are reluctant to share their financial resources. So then I would invite, well, what are you willing to share? I'd invite a question about what else that you have would you be willing to share? Are you willing to give your time? Are you willing to go and see the work? Are you willing to go and learn about that community? Because I think often when people take advantage of those sorts of opportunities, they come back with a very different view of poverty, and even to the extent that they are impoverished, they themselves.
Yes.
And how that changes your orientation around generosity.
Yeah. So good, Amelia. So good. I'm just so grateful for this conversation, and it's bringing me back to college in a bit and some of the things that I haven't thought deeply about in a while, RCTs and how to think about research methodologies. As we're wrapping up, what is one way in this season of life that you are learning about what it means to love generously like Jesus?
Before I answer that question, I hope it's okay that I also say this has really been a wonderful conversation for me, Brian, and also just to appreciate the thoughtfulness with which you engage in these sort of discussions, and to be willing to offer a sort of counter view to the mainstream view of development work and funding. I think it's really helpful, and then to also ground all of that in a real commitment to living out the word of the Lord. And I think that's rare to sort of put all of that in balance. I think I don't encounter these sorts of opportunities as often as I think they should be made available. So thank you for the work that you're doing. And for me, I think just sort of being open to being open to learn. I know you invited me here because of the work that I've done in Meal, but I also am learning from this experience. And I think in this season, I've been invited to learn and to see things from different perspectives, both in terms of the work that I do, but then also in terms of what others are doing in very different spaces. I was just at a conference yesterday at Morehouse College here in Atlanta that focuses on global health, and I just was thinking, you would have loved to have been there. I have to make sure you know about the next one.
Next time. Yes.
Yes, I will. I just learned of it recently, but and so it's just one example of conversations and opportunities that I've been invited in to just be willing to learn. And it's something that I hope that I never not love. And I think it's one of the things that keeps me humble, but then also allows me to see things in different ways. So thank you for this invitation to think about the work in different ways, to learn about your passion forward, to learn about your own expertise in this area. It's been a real blessing.
The invitation to grow this week is to pray for Christian organizations that have been impacted by cuts to foreign aid. Pray for new sources of provision and growth. Thank you so much to Amelia Thompson for sharing your expertise with us. And if you have feedback on this episode, you can reach me at brian@simplecharity.org. As a reminder, please hit subscribe in your podcast app and give us a rating and review if you haven't done so already. Next time, a conversation on the nonprofit sector with someone who founded a nonprofit in the anti-trafficking space and now works as a consultant to faith-based nonprofit organizations. I hope you join me as we continue to learn to love generously like Jesus. Have a great week. See you next time.